Eamon Ryan, Green Party leader, thank you very much for joining us for a series of leaders' interviews for General Election 2020. You're very welcome.
Glad to be here.
To start off, everyone's been talking about change this week, and it's largely centred around how well Sinn Fein are doing in the polls, which I think is unexpected. But if this was going to be the general election where the Irish people wanted change, how come the Green Party wasn't able to capitalise on that or benefit from that desire to change?
I think we still can and will. I think we had a poll there yesterday showing us some of the chance of winning the last seat between Cleo Murphy and Danny Healy-Rae for the last seat. If we can win in the kingdom, if we can turn the kingdom green, I think we can turn the whole country green. And I'd say it is about change this election. And I'd have to say, just in relation to Sinn Féin, they're missing the biggest change of all. I mean, yes, we need to change our housing system. Yes, we need to change our health system. But if we don't change and tackle climate change, all will be to no avail. And their manifesto completely ignores it. They've no money for the actions we need to take. They say at the start, oh, we're ambitious, we want to tackle climate change, but then say nothing else. And that's not going to be good. It's not going to be good for the economy. It's not going to. We need to change housing and do climate change at the same time and put housing close to public transport and proper infrastructure. That's the change we need in housing, as well as providing all the numbers. We need to change health and climate change at the same time, like improve our health in improving our own local environment, allowing our kids to actually get active and play on streets, which we grew up and have been able to do and kids can't do anymore. And my God, we need to change transport. Like, this country's gridlocking, it's stuck in traffic. And that's ignored. You know, everyone is all, the three parties on the debate last night, all, oh, everything stays the same, we'll build most roads and we'll build everything. There's no change. And the reason we need to change is because the world is burning. Like, we're on fire and we have to stop it and play our part in it, and doing so would be better for us as a people. And I think the last 2 days people need to think about that. If they want us to be green as a country, to be part of the world taking on this biggest challenge of all, then they're going to have to vote green, because none of the other, particularly the three big parties that spoke last night, show any intention of changing how we approach that issue.
I know at the moment that those, certainly two of the bigger three parties anyway, have specifically mentioned the Greens as a party that they'd like to go into power with. And on the criticism of Sinn Féin's manifesto, I heard Micheál Martin describe it as almost be like climate denial. So from your perspective, from a Green perspective, would it be easier to go in with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and get them to move towards climate than it would be to get Sinn Féin to do it? This
change has to involve everyone. Every place matters, every community. I believe in our constitutional democratic republic, so whoever the people elect, we will work with them. None of those three parties are really addressing it. But what we would do, if we're in the position, if we can win 1 in 10 even Irish voters to go green on Saturday, we'd probably get about 15 plus seats, a good team. And that team would go in, sit down, would talk to whoever else is elected and say, let's do this. Let's heed the science. Let's play our role in tackling the biggest challenge of all. And it would start in transport, in terms of we're going to have to switch to public transport, walking and cycling. It's the only way our transport system is going to work anyway. None of the others are talking about that or have really been questioned about it. It didn't come up in any debate. Transport policy in this country is broken. We need to fix it. We'd sit down, everyone says, oh yes, we're all into renewable energy, we're all into insulation. And we'd sit down and say, okay, we've thought about this in real detail and this is the steps we need to take. Here's the investment. Here's the way we get the workers trained to be able to do it. And again, no one's showing, I mean, Sinn Féin's budget was pittance really in terms of tackling that fundamental. And it's the best way of tackling fuel poverty, improving people's homes, making them well insulated. We'd sit down with all the other parties and it would be difficult, talking about how we manage our land. Not just farming, but talking about how we'll do forestry in a completely different way. So the forests we have are a joy to walk through, that are full of wildlife. That's a huge project. Like, we're talking about changing the entire system of how we manage our land. And it's been ignored. Not a word. Nothing in the manifestos. No real ambition. So if we're in that position, if the people see fit to vote for us on Saturday, which I hope they will, and we have the possibility of contributing to debate on the formation and programme for government, they're going to have a tough time talking to us, because we're going to have to say first thing up, lads, your manifesto, and ladies, is not up to the task. We need to do more.
And I mean, on that, as you said, the world is on fire. There's been huge climate movements in Ireland over the last year. So it must be a disappointment that climate hasn't really been one of the top issues of this election, not to the scale that I think a lot of people expected it to be.
Not over yet. It's understandable. Listen, when you're walking down a street, you see someone in a sleeping bag in a shop front, or in a tent on the canal. I mean, obviously, we got to tackle that, and that's what's driving, a lot of people's anger and desire for change. Or similarly, if you've got a relative who's in a trolley, I mean, that's first priority, first things first. We do need to tackle all that. But we broadly agree on that sláinte care is the way to tackle the health system. We broadly agree that we're going to have to build public housing. We do a lot of cost rental, like the Vienna model, to give rental options for a whole load of people at much lower cost. But where we disagree is on climate. There's a real point of difference. And that's in the electorate's mind. I don't think the electorate have actually lost that interest over the last year that they've shown in climate. It's still there, particularly younger people, because they know it's their future that has been put at risk. We don't want to hand on, as Catherine Martin said the other night, an IOU to our next generation, that they're going to have to pay for the whole thing. And I think deep down the Irish people want to do it, both rural and urban. This nonsense about, this is going to be bad for rural Ireland, it's rubbish. It's going to be good for rural Ireland. It's going to be good for all of Ireland. And in any negotiations, first things first, you're saying is, let's get the rural public transport services in place. Let's get the urban public transport systems in Cork, Waterford, Limerick, Galway, as well as Dublin. Doing it the way the other parties want to do it, to just lay out motorways everywhere, coming to inevitable gridlock, that's cuckoo. And I think Irish people know that, and I think they might vote. In the last few days, there's still a fifth of the voters, there's still swing voters. I'm asking them to vote Green.
And on that point about agriculture, like when you listen to, in particular, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and the way that they talk about measures like reducing the national herd, or how nervous they can get around some proposals that might be, in a way, negative to agriculture. Do you think that at this point there's been a failure in messaging which has made some people in rural Ireland feel that the climate justice agenda is a threat to them?
I talked to a lot of farmers, spent a lot of time in this campaign, spent 2 hours with the IFA the other day, and they realised that actually the world is going in this direction. The European Union is going with the European Green Deal. The Common Agricultural Policy reform, which has to be done in the next 2 years, is all about protecting the environment and paying farmers properly for that. We have a real crisis in Irish farming. They're not getting paid properly, particularly the beef farmers. There's no young people, not no, but there's very few young people. Like I was speaking to Kerry a minute ago, 60% of farms in Kerry don't have someone to inherit the land, to take on the farm. And we want to protect the Irish family farm. Like, we want a new generation of young people, not just farmers, but foresters and people, fishermen, and minding our bogs. And also, rural land isn't just farming. Like, there are 4 legs in the stool. We want tourism jobs. That benefits from us going green. We want energy jobs. That's where the energy resource is in rural Ireland. We want digital jobs, services, so people don't have to be stuck in long-distance commuting. We're good at all 4. We overcome the fear that some may have, not by telling people what to do or thinking we know everything. We ask them for help. We listen to them. We admit it's going to be learned by doing. It has to be appropriate for local areas. It comes from the bottom up, not just top down. But it needs leadership at the top too. Like, if we just say, Ireland is opting out, and rural Ireland particularly is opting out from this transition, we're not doing a service for our people. They're going to have to face the difficulties that climate change brings, but also we want to be known as climate laggards. We want to be known as a green country which isn't green. That would make no sense. That would be bad for Ireland.
And you talk about the farmers that you've spoken to who are very understanding, but we know that in Ireland often normal people can be way ahead of the politicians. Would you have faith in parties like Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael that are very conscious of their base in rural Ireland to have the bravery to take those measures that might reduce, say, carbon emissions from agriculture in Ireland?
I have faith in the Irish people, the decency of the Irish people, the sense that they want to play a role. And I have faith in our democratic system. So if they're voting for people, well, they're representative, you listen to and you work with and you talk to. The blind boy from the Rubber Bandits, he was on late a few months ago. He put it really well. He said, people say, why should we do it when America isn't doing it? Okay, and our carbon footprint's small. It isn't really. Our carbon footprint is the equivalent of 400 million of the poorest people in the world. We're a high emitter. But he said, more important than that, whatever about our carbon footprint, our cultural footprint is big. We go out as a country which is proud of our land, of Ireland, of our green island. And I think the Irish people will not want to be called laggards anymore. I think we're ready to show leadership. And I think what they want is just the practical solutions that will help us do that. And they have to be solutions that improve people's quality of life, protect jobs and the economy, but it's an economy that serves society, not society serving the economy. And that's the change we can put. That's what they call the just transition, when you actually get a better economic model at the same time as you make the change, the big change, tackling climate change.
Do you think this election would have been a bit easier for you if some of the movements like Extinction Rebellion hadn't been apolitical, and if they had maybe clearly endorsed your party? Do you think that would have made a difference?
That's not their job. I worked in an environmental NGO before. You can't be party political. And I'll be honest, they've stood up to the plate, not just in the last year, but they've been out going door to door. I've seen houses across this city and across the country where that small kind of pledge is on it that we will tackle. They've done the assessment of all the different manifestos, and what they saw is that, yes, ours is the most ambitious. But the really worrying thing is in Sinn Féin, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, they gave them an F and an E. They failed. So they've done their job. I think it's up to the electorate now, I hope, to actually, if they want this change, if they want Ireland green, to vote green. It can't be just NGOs. It can't be just us as politicians. It's got to come from the people. And the way it comes from the people is through the vote.
And one of the really important measures in your manifesto is the carbon tax. I think you want it to be, is it €100 per tonne compared to Fine Gael's target, which is 80. But there is some dispute about the carbon tax, particularly in the way that Sinn Féin talks about it. Do you have any nervousness that if you went in to support the next government, there would be an attempt to turn an increase in the carbon tax into almost like a mini water charges movement?
No, I don't think so, because it's different. We've approached it in a very different way. Like the Oireachtas Committee spent a lot of time, all parties, thinking about this. And we reached agreement that whatever we do in carbon tax, the effect has to be protected. We have to make sure we protect those in lower incomes from any effect of it. And whether we do that through carbon dividends, which is we're suggesting, giving the money back to people, or whether we do it by targeting all the money to, let's say, improving the housing quality, particularly those in lower incomes, and that way address fuel poverty. That's a point of division, but it's not a significant point. We're agreed in the basic principle. It's only one of the measures we need. It's only one of the pieces we need, but we do need it. And again, Sinn Féin was the other day, it doesn't work, and it doesn't work in Canada. We brought in a leading expert from Canada and asked him in the Oireachtas, well, has it worked? And it's not the be-all and end-all, but the academic, she came back and said, yeah, it actually has, and it is part of the solution. But it's not the only part. The problem with Sinn Féin's things, they're not no to carbon tax, but then no to all the other measures as well. Like no to providing the sort of funds we need to improve our housing, no really switch away in agriculture, no real change in transport. So I think there's been so much attention on the carbon tax, it's actually missed the bigger picture story, that there's nothing else in the plans, other parties' plans, and we're not going to make the leap we need to make unless we make those investments too.
You must have felt very popular with some of the bigger parties since the local elections. I think that throughout this, you've been named a lot by Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar as an ideal coalition partner. So it seems like no matter what happens next week, somebody will be wanting to talk to you about going into government. Everybody knows what happens to progressive parties when they go in with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. Do you have any concern about basically suffering serious electoral Do you have any concerns about suffering serious electoral consequences if you go in and are seen as propping up Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? I'm thinking in particular of people in your party like Saoirse McHugh who would have said that they were really against that.
Yeah, and our party allows for different views. My experience is that you can affect change in government, and if you're standing for election saying you want to change everything, well, you should be willing to do sometimes the hard things by going into government and really trying to work to deliver that change. But also, this is not a career option. You know, we're not in it just to get a job. We're in it to make the change. This decade is vital. We don't have time left now. We have to act now, from our perspective. And waiting for some ideal, perfect opportunity when all is rosy and whatever electoral... No, you strike when you can and do what you can when you can, and that's now. And we'll see. It's very uncertain what the outcome of this election is going to be. Very hard to see how government can be formed out of the numbers in the polls. But the Irish people have to act first. They have to decide who they want to represent them. And I think the Dáil will work. It took us 3 months last time. It might take a similar long time this time. But I think we will have the ability, I hope, to form a government. But I hope it doesn't ignore climate change. Because if to do that and set out on this most vital decade of all on the wrong path would be a fatal mistake.
Would you have any worry that if you went in and you had to take the blame for some unpopular decisions taken by whichever the bigger party is, the same way that Labour did, I guess, after the coalition, that it might damage the climate change movement if people feel that they can't vote Green anymore after that?
Yeah, but as I said, now is the time to affect change. And also, my experience is in government, it's tough because you have to take collective cabinet responsibility, but also you have collective cabinet authority. So you're there to actually try and make sure that the right decisions are made in every sector. We're not just there about the environment. We kind of come from a position that everything is connected to the environment, and you have to look at every portfolio. And one of the reasons I'm hoping we might get a team of about 15 TDs is that means you have a person covering every department. And so you have a strong voice and an opportunity to direct what happens in the arts, what happens in education, what happens in social services, and so on. So it's not easy, but we need people to step up to that role. And it's whether you get rewarded or not is a secondary issue.
Very good. Obviously, a major issue for the people who watch JOE.ie is renting, and you have a lot of measures in your manifesto. Sale of a property no longer being means of kicking someone out, for example, and you spoke about the Vienna model as well. What's become a very popular proposal with young people over the course of this election is the rent freeze, which has been put forward a lot by Sinn Féin and Labour. What's your own view on that?
We supported that in the DAW, but can I say, I think where we all agree that the market's not working and it has to change, and the state has to step up, and local government particularly. We believe in particular that this Vienna model, the cost rental model, is the key change, because if we just go back to the old way, you're either in a council house or your own house and there's nothing else, or well, maybe there's a rented sector but it's forgotten about and there's no rights and there's no security of tenure. That's not what we want. The advantage of cost rental, it is what it says in the tin. The rent covers the cost of the construction and maintenance. It's much lower because the land is given for free. It's state land, or with CPO land to use it. And you can do it at scale, so you'd hopefully bring down the costs. Everyone can access it. It's sought after, so you get a whole mix of different tenants. If someone can't afford it, you give a rent supplement so that everyone can get access to it. You build it stays in public ownership, so over the long term, it takes time. You have a public asset that you can keep renewing and bringing new generations, giving them secure at a young age. Not being with mammy when you're 29. Being able to have a secure 10-year. I know I'm going to be here for the next 10 years. I know my rent is not going to increase. That's the best way of getting rent security. And it needs initiative. Like Fine Gael said they want to do it, but they have two tiny examples. I'm local, this is my area. I'd start here. I'd start in Cahilborough Barracks in Rathmines. Now the army, I think we'd have to give them a new barracks, obviously, out in Baldonnel or somewhere like that, really state of the art, so they benefit from it. And then that land, within walking distance of town, you could have thousands of people living there, really high quality place to live. On the other side of the Liffey, Broadstone Garage, we use it for parking buses. Again, 20 acres is it? Thousands of people could live there with looking out over Dublin. It's on a hill. Looking out over Dublin in a high quality urban environment, which is again within walking distance of town. Let's do that as a way of tackling the rent crisis. It's actually it has to be in options that are open to everyone, where the rents are actually brought down. And what the advantage of this is, it brings the market rents down because these apartments are in the market, but they're lower cost, so it helps bring the entire rental price markets down. That's why we're so keen on it.
So what would happen then if, Brendan Howan was in here and he said that the rent freeze for him is like a red line in a programme for government. He's talked a lot about this idea of yourselves, Labour and Soc Dems maybe bunching together and being a progressive bloc. If they wanted to put that in a programme for government to maybe force the country into a referendum if the rent freeze was unconstitutional, would you have a problem supporting that?
No, I think we'd work well together. I think we'd work with Labour. We'd be pushing. They agreed with us in the cost rental model when we put it to a Dáil vote 2 years ago. So we'd work with them in delivering it. We agree with the Soc Dems on Sláinte Géir. Róisín Shorter was very involved in the committee, but we came to that was already our perspective in terms of, so yeah, let's deliver it. I don't see that's going to be a difficulty. It's a matter of getting it done. It's a matter of not just talking, but actually making it happen.
Another thing that struck out in your manifesto when I was reading it was your strong policy on the decriminalisation of drugs. And that's something that a lot of people have wanted for a long time. Fine Gael didn't really end up doing it in government. Fianna Fáil, I couldn't find anything in their manifesto about it. Labour tried to do it when they were in the coalition. Aoife O'Riordan was a strong advocate, but it didn't work out for them. If somebody was trying to use your party to get into government, would you be willing to make the decriminalisation of drugs a red line?
Just to go back once there, the Taoiseach, in fairness to him, I raised it, or it was raised at the debate in Galway with Claire Byrne, and the Taoiseach, in fairness to him, backed up what we were saying, that actually what we need to do is treat the issue of drugs as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. That going down this route of criminal justice sanctions against maybe people who have a small quantity of cannabis or, is just we're putting people in prison who are actually becoming addicts because prison's full of drugs. But the health-based approach is the right way to go. Firstly, because there are risks. Like, we should be straight and honest with young people, particularly. At a young age, brains are forming, and drugs, you have to be really careful. There's a lot of stuff on the streets that's really strong, and it's not like a carte blanche, whatever anyone wants anywhere, it is a health issue. But that's a better way of approaching it. Follow the example that they did in Portugal, that if someone's got a problem with drugs, you treat them as a health issue. You don't go straight to the criminal justice system, because that approach hasn't worked.
That surely is like a hard thing to get through politically, because immediately, I guess, there's still some misunderstandings of the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. And also people don't like the idea of the government taking a position that might be perceived in some quarters as being soft on crime. So surely that would be a difficult thing to get through, wouldn't it?
There's loads of examples though, like you look to international, you look at best practice and you get best advice, and you look at what they've done in Australia, you look at what they've done in Canada, you look at what they've done in the States, you look at what they've done in Portugal, and you see what has led to the best outcome, which is better health outcome, a better criminal justice. I think it would actually lead to less problems in the criminal justice system, which would help us really target the criminals that we need to do so. So it's actually a more efficient system. But you look at international best practice and you try and bring them in here. I think that's the way to do it. And if you're doing it on that evidence-based trial and test and be careful and be sure, then I don't see why people would fundamentally object.
One of the things that has been thrown against your party a lot during this campaign is the perception, maybe misconception, that your party is all about taxes, that it's all about putting penalties on people to change their behaviour. Is that a fair...
No, I do think, and we'd agree with the Labour and Soc Dems on this, I suppose, the fundamental problem in this country at the moment, our economy is doing well, in truth. It's grown rapidly in the last 5 years. We've near full employment. But actually people's quality of life has not improved. And the reason for that is because there's actually a shortage of public services. Danny McCoy from IBEC, the head of the Irish Business Employers Federation, gave a speech last month where he said, our private sector has grown rapidly. We've 800,000 new people working in the private sector in the last 30, 40 years. Our public sector hasn't increased commensurately. And he said, the business community is saying, actually what you need is we need better public services. We need better housing, transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, all the things that make life tolerable and allow us, particularly if we get housing and transport together, good planning. That all takes resources, it takes funds. And I think in this election, there's two approaches to that, the likes of ourselves and Labour and others saying, yeah, we can't be cutting taxes, in truth, because we need the money to make sure our trolley crisis doesn't get worse. We need the money to make sure that there's housing for young people. You can't be promising, oh, we're going to cut every tax and increase every service. We've done that before in this country and it did not serve the Irish people, and I think we're in the same situation now.
Your party came out with a proposal last year which got a lot of attention at the time, which was the reintroduction of wolves. And I know in some quarters it got turned into a meme or whatever, but actually when you look into it, there's strong arguments in favour of it from a biodiversity, there's strong ecological arguments in favour of it, but I know some people thought it was too radical. But if you're going to bring in a climate justice model, shouldn't you be pressing ahead with radical ideas even when people... do you regret dropping that idea?
Well, listen, I probably could have done it in a cleverer way. It went a bit viral. It was a howler at the time to put into wolf parlance. But I was actually really keen, and we had a big forestry motion before the Dáil, recognising we currently have 11% forest. We think we need to get up to 30%, which is about the European average. We think it needs a completely different forestry model, going away for this plantations, industrial type forestry, which is biodiversity dead, really, and towards much more varied forests, natural forests, continuous cover forests, but also forests that self-regenerate. Just naturally, this happens in nature. Trees come up from the ground. The thing that's stopping that at the moment is there's overgrazing, particularly deer is a big issue, and invasive species is a real issue. It's a really difficult thing to know how we manage. I mentioned that, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. It's a long term, because it would be difficult now because we're an island. the wolves coming in. It's happened in every other European country. They're in Holland and in Belgium and in Germany and in France and in Italy and in Spain. They manage it and they get certain benefits. And you're right, the best example was, I think, in Yellowstone. They showed an example. When you do reintroduce a predator, it actually changes the entire ecosystem. It's what they call the cascade effect, where deer actually don't overgraze because they're nervous. They're looking around thinking, be careful here. And as a result of that, nature starts restoring itself. And I suppose I was just trying to make the point, let's get nature to do some of the work and give nature space. And it's not just on land. I mean, one of the big projects I'd like to see introduced is the development of marine protected areas. Like, our sea area is 10 times our land area. It's some of the most important area in the world, in that the North Atlantic's changing. It's changing because of the Arctic melt coming down, because the circulation system seems to be changing. I'd love to set aside 50%, following the advice of E.O. Wilson, the greatest ecologist in the world today, living man, ecologist, and set aside half of it for wildlife and use that as a scientific study to really measure what's happening and put our floating offshore wind turbines in those areas so we actually generate the power to run our country. This is all doable. This is coming. This is the way the world is going. We need to be leading that. We need to be ahead of that. We can be good at it. Restoring nature is restoring ourselves. It's helping ourselves. That's what I wanted to get across.
But it sounds like you think that policy, like, I'm not looking for a headline here where it's like Eamon Ryan insists on wolves in the next programme for government, but it sounds like maybe in the long term, like, the right thing to do is actually to look at a policy like that.
Yeah, no, it is. But I suppose I was nervous about it. I am now, because maybe it fed into that thing, kind of rural Ireland, farmers saying, oh, we couldn't possibly do that. And I was just nervous that I don't want to lose that constituency. I want to keep them on. We want to make sure that they are listened to and understand what's, and also particularly because in places like Leitrim, I've been up there a lot, they're really terrified by what's happening with forestry, because actually communities are getting isolated because you've got these deep, dark, dense forests and no farms and kind of people leaving the land. And what I want to get a point across is, if we go this different forestry model, where it's really natural forest with the whole variety of incomes coming out of it, long-term supply of timber, high-quality timber coming out of it, much more tourism because people want to walk through natural forests, and it's a beautiful place to be. That's the key message. It's let's turn forestry around so it makes this country a joy to walk through.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, I think I saw on some of the kind of pro-choice Facebook pages, some people were pointing out that some of the Green candidates had either been ambiguous on the 8th Amendment or maybe they hadn't been in favour of it. And that's not a bad thing. There's lots of parties that have different views. For some people, it's a very profound issue. But I was just wondering, I had a look at the reproductive rights part of your manifesto, and it wasn't clear on whether or not you would be in favour of scrapping the mandatory 3-day waiting period between which a woman has to basically ask for an abortion and then wait 3 days before she can access one. I think a lot of people would have seen it as something that was invented by Fine Gael to get people like Simon Coveney on board. Do you have a personal view on that, or do you have a
just
position?
Go back to the fundamental point, because it did come up in the campaign, what's individual. And just as I said earlier in relation to Saoirse, that you have to be tolerant of different views within a party, and there are people in our party, in every party, who voted different ways in the referendum. That's not something that's a, kind of their choice. We do say in our party you have to buy into, we have to vote as a collective if you're elected to support party policy, and that we will do. And anyone in our party who may have voted one or other way in the referendum will do that. So I don't see that as a particular problem. I'm sure every party has people with different views. And with regard to kind of reopening the whole board, there are certain issues that I think are immediately key that we have to address, the exclusion zones and kind of issues like that. And yes, our party is looking to try and make sure that whatever else happened, no woman is in any way put to any hardship, disgrace, shame, obstacles whatsoever in implementing the wish of the Irish people in that referendum. I'll be honest, in terms of going further, in terms of opening up the provisions of the legislation, I'm slightly nervous, because I think to a certain extent I'd prefer to see it working now properly and in those sort of approaches. And I think there'll be people on the other side saying, oh, we need to change the legislation, and other people saying, I think there was broad agreement among the Irish people what we were doing, and in the Dáil, I think we should definitely act on the whole exclusion room, because if that impedes any woman whatsoever, it should be stopped. But I'm nervous around reopening that debate. I think we managed that in a way that didn't bring some of the divisions of the 1980s, and that's where I would prefer to keep that approach.
And finally, you mentioned Saoirse. I couldn't really do the interview without mentioning the video that she did with us, which was really popular. She had mentioned some radical ideas like dismantling the state. She had made a joke about the guillotine and revolution. Some people didn't like it, but among a lot of young people, it seemed really popular. I'm just wondering, did you get, when you were watching that interview, did you think that maybe there might be merit in the Green Party becoming a little bit more radical, especially when you look at how Sinn Féin seem to be doing so well
in this?
I met
Saoirse about 2 years ago. We were talking about rural development and farming and new forms of agriculture, and I was really impressed by her. I think, wow, she's really knowledgeable. And met her again, and she was saying to me just in passing, she said, it's really frustrating. I'm going to the other parties with these radical ideas and no one's listening. They pretend they're listening and they're not really listening. And I said to her, I kind of decide on the spot, I said, you should run for us because we are listening and we do think, we need to think outside the box and big and differently. And I think my advice to her, which was the advice I give to every single candidate, I spent a lot of time asking people to run, speak your truth, speak your mind, don't be afraid to speak your truth, and she does that, and I respect that.
So you didn't mind the guillotine comment in the video?
I think I agree with her in this key thing. The economic model is changing. This whole idea that the market knows best and the society serves the economy, that's over. We need markets to serve society. We need an economy that's full of values and a sense of purpose and a sense of obligation to actually serving the really big challenges we have in housing, in health, but more than anything else in changing to address climate change. We all need to row in behind that.
That was great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.